Okay, we're going to start the meeting now. My name's Esme, I'm from Manchester SWP. I'm going to be chairing this meeting. I'd like to welcome you all to today's meeting, which is on Imperialism and the Third World. Our speaker today is Chris Harman, who's the editor of Socialist Worker and also the author of numerous publications, including A People's History of the World. We're going to run the meeting, for people who haven't been to a meeting yet. Chris is going to do an introduction for about 35 minutes. We're then going to open it up to discussion, contributions, questions, things that people want to raise from the floor. And then Chris will come back at the end of the meeting for 5 or 10 minutes to reply to any questions and to sum up the discussion. We are going to be using a speaker slip system in this meeting, which is really just to make sure that we can include as many people with as many broad points in the discussion as we can, which means that team members, the people in the black T-shirts, will be going around with the little paper slips. And if you've got a point that you want to make or a question that you want to raise or something that you want to add to the discussion, if you just fill in your main points on that piece of paper and give it back to them, then we'll try and call as many people as we can in the discussion. If people have got questions that they want to raise, I would encourage people to come and ask the questions themselves. If you want to speak in the meeting, you don't have to make some great lengthy contribution. But if people don't want to come and speak and they've got questions that they want reading out, if they make that clear on the slip, I will read questions out to the meeting that people want raised if they don't want to come and ask them themselves. Right, I'm just going to hand over now to Chris, who's going to introduce the meeting.
One of the themes at this Marxism has been the theme of imperialism. It's worth spelling out what we mean by imperialism. In the course of the 20th century, right up to today, people have talked about imperialism in a specific sense, meaning the merger, the coming together of the people who control the biggest sections of business and the state, so that the competition between capitalists takes the form of competition to carve up the world between major capitalist powers, and they carve up the world in order to exploit the world more thoroughly, more deeply, more viciously than before. Two elements: clashes between major capitalist powers and the exploitation of the rest of the world. We've seen what capitalist war means with two wars in the last 18 months, the death toll in Afghanistan, still rising, the death toll in Afghanistan, the death toll in Iraq, and so forth. People also should be aware of the other death toll caused by imperialism in a modern sense. The report in the Lancet, the Journal of the British Medical Association, last week, referred to 6 million unnecessary child deaths a year in third world countries. 6 million a year, for anyone who's good at mental arithmetics, works out 18,000 a day, which is effectively 6 world trade centres going down every day, every week, every year, deaths which take place when we talk about imperialism in this sense. And when we talk about, but it's not merely important to understand this. I think one of the most important things about the anti-capitalist movement which developed since Seattle is the way in which people from various backgrounds, from charities, NGOs, and so forth, have begun to grasp the reality of what's taking place. But grasping reality, we also have to try and understand the roots and the actual character of what's occurring. Because if you don't, you can easily end up coming to false conclusions. For instance, you can come to the conclusion still that somehow you can separate off fighting the causes of deaths in third world countries from the drive towards war. This clearly is a conclusion Claire Short came to, changed her mind again, and changed her mind a third time. But people are better than Claire Short. Bernard Cassin, the leader of the French anti-capitalist organisation ATTAC, or the anti-globalisation organisation ATTAC, who was actually opposed to the Iraq war, said, however, fighting the war was not that important, opposing the war was not that important, because regardless of the outcome of the war, it made no difference to the number of people dying of poverty in Latin America. Or you can have the attitude of Manhart, who co-wrote with Negri the book Empire, who really wrote in The Guardian, that big business didn't really want the Iraq war, big business can exploit the world in other means. Now here I think there's various other forms of way in which people actually underrate how deeply ingrained third world poverty is into the system as it exists today, and how how impossible it is really to deal with this if you talk through the process of scratching the surface of the system of piecemeal reform. There's a man, Kevin Watkins, who is research director, I think, of Oxfam, Oxfam is one of the charities become increasingly politicised in recent years. I've seen their banner on demonstrations in Seville and so forth. But his conclusion really is, if only we broke down protectionism, if only we had free trade across the world, free trade in agricultural goods, this would deal with much of the stuff, poverty and suffering and so forth. What I think is very, very important to understand, what's the poverty you talk about in the third world is not a result of couldn't be solved by some tinkering with the system. It's inbuilt into the system that exists today. To put it very, very crudely, the world system as it exists today is devised in such a way that whole areas of the world, resources flow out of them. They flow out on the basis of free trade. They flow out if you have protection, they flow out if you have free trade, because the very structure of world capitalism means resources flow from some section of the world to the other. And this is because capitalism is a system based upon the drive towards profit and accumulation. Capitalists find it much more profitable to accumulate in certain parts of the world rather than others, and this means for them the whole area of the world become completely increasingly marginal as regards their main preoccupations. And of course, this is not, it should be added, this is not a process which grew up higgledy-piggledy or by accident. It's a process which has causes in terms of the earlier history of imperialism. At various other meetings taking place at Marxism this week, you will hear, for instance, how the effect of British rule in India, Britain battened upon India, or the British East India Company intervened in India, a period of crisis, the end of the Mughal Empire. India was in a deep crisis. Britain intervened. The effect was to prevent that crisis having an outcome which led to increasing wealth, increasing growth of the economy and so forth in India, but instead led to a succession of aggregated famines, economic stagnation. So at the end of British rule in India, according to some estimates, output of food per head was lower than it had been under the Mughal Emperor Akbar, who reigned at the time of Henry VIII. That's about 1520. If you talk about about the rise of capitalism in Europe, you can't talk about it, as another meeting at Marxism will tell you, without talking about slavery, the transportation of very, very large numbers of young men and women from Africa to the Americas, resulting in devastation to whole areas of African economy, depopulation, underpopulation of Africa. Despite mythology, Africa is an underpopulated continent today, not an overpopulated continent, and led to economic retardation. So that Africa from economic, if you want to talk in terms of advance and backward, from being a few tens or perhaps a couple of hundred years at most behind Europe in its economic development, became retarded and pushed backward at precisely the point in which Europe and North America advanced economically. You have to talk about the classic imperialism of the 1880s and 1890s, in which the raw material, which European empires reached out to get raw materials from elsewhere in the world, destroying civilizations, waging wars, battling, causing famines, murdering people wholesale in order to get the resources, and devastating economic structures and so forth. And then investing, but usually investing in order to build in railways and ports and so forth, which our aim was to further encourage the private facilities for dragging more resources out. That's what classic imperialism wants. The outcome by the middle of this century was that you had some areas of the world which had reached what bourgeois economists call takeoff, at which economic redundancy had taken place, other areas which hadn't, but also the gap between the two widened to such extent that it becomes increasingly difficult for very, very large areas of the world to overcome the gap. This is the basic structure. Something also happened, and when I say today that this process takes place even where you have free trade, you don't need the direct intervention of Western states to keep this process flowing in most of the world. It happens because, essentially, once this process has taken place, capital becomes concentrated in some parts of the world. These are the parts of the world where it therefore becomes profitable for capitalists further to invest. The other side of it, quite interestingly, 50 years, 60 or 70 years ago, certainly 100 years ago, the great capitalist combines in the West, very, very dependent upon raw materials they took from third world countries, from then colonial countries. You'll find some people who inside the anti-capitalist movement today, anti-imperialism, who believe this is still true. Unfortunately, in a certain sense, it's not true. If you go through, it's quite interesting, if you go through where the great sources for food in the world today are, they're usually in advanced capitalist countries. The world's biggest grain exporter is the United States of America. Close behind that is Australia. Of the non-fuel minerals, 8 of the 10 biggest exporters of non-fuel minerals are advanced capitalist countries. Only 2 non-advanced countries, which is Brazil and Chile, which are in the league of being the big exporters of raw materials. What actually you're talking about is a world in which had to be structured by the development of capitalism over the last century, so that some sections, so the capitalists operate in certain sections of the world and are less dependent upon, for their core profits, and I'll be very careful how I put this, for their core profits upon other sections of the world. This has the effect on other sections of the world that from a capitalist point of view, they become marginal. They can be written off. This is true overwhelmingly of vast chunks of Africa. If you're a capitalist, and it's well spelt out in Susan George's book, I can't remember what the book was called, the report, the Lugano report, in which she says, really from a capitalist point of view, they could work out a program for eliminating much of the population of Africa. It'd do away with embarrassment for them, because they have so impoverished Africa since the scramble for Africa in the 1880s that today Africa is like a squeezed lemon, much of it for them. They don't need it. It's not central to their system. It therefore becomes somewhere which is less important to them. It's true of whole areas of Asia. There are exceptions, and it should be said they're important exceptions. Southeast Korea, Taiwan, above all Southeast China, are an important exception. These are areas which have succeeded over the last 50, 60 years in entering, if you like, the second or third division of advanced capitalism. But it's worth remembering the price for doing so. The price for doing so was decades, sometimes generations, of near totalitarian dictatorships. In the case of China, in order to accumulate the basic resources needed to create what exists now in Southeast China, you had 30 years of the most intense Stalinism, the great leap forward, attempt to industrialise, which cost now, it's estimated, 30 or 40 million lives in famine and so on and so forth. South Korea, most miserable military dictatorship from effectively 1945 right through until the late 1980s. This is the reality you're talking about, where people say a few third world countries have developed. So less successful, but they're, I don't know, the 5th or 6th division of capitalism, Mexico, Brazil. But even here, you have to say where this has taken place, the gains which are made are only temporary gains. They're not permanent, they don't provide security in the sense, if you talk about Argentina, was the one country in Latin America which was once regarded as an advanced industrial country, living standards as high as those in France. Today, people are aware living standards in Argentina are lower than those in Paraguay, huge levels of unemployment, huge levels of impoverishment, complete dependency upon the International Monetary Fund, and so on and so forth. We'll talk about this a bit, but when we talk about the world as a whole, to give some idea of how capitalism sees the world as a whole, you can tell where capitalism sends its capital exports. 100 years ago, the vast bulk, Britain was the biggest capitalist country, the major bulk of British capital exports, or a huge chunk of them, probably about half of them, went to the countries of the British Empire. Considerable numbers went to North America then, but a considerable portion went to the countries of the British Empire and to some degree to Latin America. You talk about where the capital exports of the capitalist world go today. 75% of the capital exports of the advanced capitalist countries go to other advanced capitalist countries. The advanced capitalist countries, someone can probably tell me what proportion of the population of the world as a whole they are. What, 10% at most, take 75% of the capital exports. That is, from capitalism's point of view, 10% of the world matters, the other 90% only matters marginally. But even more than that, if you look at the other 25%, which are said to go to what papers like the Financial Times called emerging markets, you find that 4/5 of those go to just 10 countries. Southeast China, Korea, probably Brazil. You find a very, very small number of countries. They don't go to most of Africa, with the possible exception of South Africa. They don't go to most of the Middle East, apart from the oil-producing enclaves. They don't go to most of South China, most of South Asia. They're concentrated in very, very few areas of the world. Interestingly as well, they don't go to Eastern Europe by and large. They don't go to the former USSR. They're concentrated in essentially advanced capitalist countries, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Southeast China, perhaps Brazil, perhaps Mexico. That's the pattern. Because these are the areas which capitalism sees itself as being, see the profits. Or to put it in Marxist terms, these are the centres of production of surplus value in the modern world. Capital is interested in surplus value. Where it doesn't have surplus value, it's not interested. Now, once you have this picture, the picture is self-reproducing. The logic is, not merely if you're a capitalist in an advanced industrial country, if you're a capitalist in a third world country, where do you put your capital? You put your capital in advanced industrial countries. When we talk about the debt crises of countries like Argentina, I suppose really we should say there's two debt crises. There's the money which the Argentine government owns the rest of the world, and there's the money which the Argentine bourgeoisie has invested in the rest of the world. The flow from the Argentine bourgeoisie puts its money in the United States. That contributes towards creating a debt problem for the Argentine government. The Argentine government then turns around to the Argentine workers and the middle class and say, we've got to pay our debts. There can be no economic development unless we pay our debts. We've got to slash into your living standards. You create a vicious circle in reality that you have impoverishment of parts of the world. What have you have impoverishment? Of course, once you have impoverishment of parts of the world, the market, even for the goods produced there, declines. The capitalists are even more inclined to move their money overseas to other countries. Well, the pattern is one, there's a vicious circle and once the vicious circle operates, it means in reality continual flow of wealth from the third world to the advanced countries. I mean, Eric Toussaint, I think he's a Belgian, isn't he? A Belgian anti-capitalist economist, gave a fascinating talk at Geneva before the Evian demonstrations a month ago. And really, he showed figures which you put together, all the flows from the advanced countries to the third world countries, the aid and the capital export and so forth. And then you put together flows from the third world countries to the advanced countries, which is capital export from third world countries to advanced countries, profit repatriation from third world countries to advanced countries, debt repayments from third world countries to advanced countries, and very, very important, what are called royalties upon intellectual copyright, i.e. paying for the use of Microsoft or for use of AIDS drugs, and you put all those together, and the flow from the third world countries to the advanced countries every year is much greater than the flow the other way. And if you take out, as I say, the exceptional countries in the third world, Southeast China, Korea and so forth, the figures are even more overwhelming. The whole world system is a system for pumping wealth from some parts of the world to the other parts of the world. As the system takes place, of course, as wealth is pumped to the more advanced parts of the world, these become the centres of production of more wealth. It's a system that can't be repeated sufficiently. For modern capitalism, the key areas of production of surplus value are in the advanced industrial countries and a handful of newly industrialising countries. This doesn't, of course, mean that the capitalists lose interest in third world countries when this happens. I mean, there's a slogan which Tesco's have, I think, which should be the slogan of every capitalist everywhere in the world: every little helps. If you're faced with succession of economic crises, as you are with, say, all the major capitalist economies at the moment, a declining rate of profit, anywhere in the world you search for money. And just as in the advanced countries, we know that really, when the bailiff knocks on the door of an unemployed person and tries to take away their television set, we know this is not really what keeps the Chase Manhattan, Barclays, Boeing, and all the great centres of world capitalism going, knocking on the doors of the unemployed to repossess their belongings. But that doesn't mean that that short of a revolution you can stop them doing those things, because all of these people, any any penny in a period of economic crisis the system matters. In the same way, deepening economic crisis means the predation on third world countries gets more and more as the third world countries get poorer and poorer. And I should say, it's not, people also say here it's just American imperialism. Since there are some people who believe somehow that French imperialism is better than American imperialism, it's worth to say that the worst predators, for instance, in Latin America at the moment, tend to be French utility companies and Spanish banks. Spanish banks, faced with being squeezed in Europe, have been expanding right across Latin America, buying up local banks, so that if you're unemployed in Buenos Aires and someone knocks on the door to repossess you, they're a representative of a Spanish bank, who, well ensconced in the progressive European Union. If it's a question of water privatisation in Brazil or Argentina, it's probably one of the French utility companies which are at stake. Electricity, there's a very, very successful struggle against electricity privatisation in southern Peru last year. It was a French company who was at stake. Actually, if you like this, faced with crises, you have this reaching out to grab the resources. You've reached an extreme case in the most impoverished parts of the world in Africa, where you have a situation, a horrific situation, where really, as Africa's been impoverished, Africa still has mineral wealth, but the mineral wealth, actually, in reality, for the world system is not as important as it was 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. I mean, Brazil is now the world's biggest tin producer, not Zambia, but that means you have local ruling classes. They themselves suffer as the world's crisis hits. They try to find ways to get wealth. Local people emerge. They do deals with big Western companies who want to get their hands on what wealth there is, and then you have the process. Western governments Western companies make alliances with local members of the local ruling class. Members of the local ruling class then go to Western governments who sell them arms on good terms, make sure they get the money back, and then they go to use those arms to grab the mineral resources, and you end up with the sort of civil wars which you face across whole tranche of West Africa and Central Africa at the moment. If you like, it's the civil wars. On the ground for the local people, it means you're a small-scale capitalist. How can you make money? You become a military capitalist on a small scale. In order to become military capitalists, you buy weapons from the big powers. To buy weapons from the big powers, you promise them some of the minerals which are in your area. I mean, people who've seen the film City of God about Brazil, you see the two gangs in Brazil operating. In this sense, it's a model of how small capitalists can operate as military capitalists in the modern world, in the most impoverished parts of the world. This is what the reality is. Now, faced with this system, what we have to say, I think it's very, very important. If this is the model we have, then people who come forward and say, really the solution to poverty in the third world is merely changing the rules of trade, really they are not offering any real solution. At the most, they are offering a means by which some local capitalists may do a bit better than other local capitalists. It's been very well exposed in the case of coffee, because Kevin Watkins of Oxfam came up with this argument that if we only had a free trade in raw materials, the whole third world would do better. And then so on do the case. The case of coffee is actually, there's free trade in coffee across the world as far as I know, mainly because no advanced Western country produces coffee. No one has an interest in protectionism. What the reality of the modern world is, however, across the world you have local capitalist classes desperate for money, local governments desperate for money. They've seen in the last 10 years entering the coffee business as a way of filling their coffers. The result is, particularly Vietnam, entered upon the production of coffee for the world market. The price of coffee has fallen, and then you have a classic situation of overproduction of coffee. Face that, if you want to talk in terms of the world system, the only other solution people come forward to is we should burn the coffee, which may solve the problems of coffee producers, but then leaves open the question that right across the third world there's people who would love to drink as much coffee each day as I do. If you burn the coffee and part of the price, you're forcing them to go back from drinking coffee to drinking some sort of substitute chicory, coffee made out of acorns, just water or something else. I mean, the idea that this is the solution to the problems in terms of the world. Now, there's one exception in terms of this picture. Well, there's actually two exceptions in terms of the picture of the third world. One of which is the area of Southeast Asia around China. I don't want to talk about this, although it should be said that this is a central strategic area in terms of the world, and may become, important clashes can develop around that. The second one, of course, is the oil exporting world. Now here, what has to be said, oil is the exception. The exception because oil is, in a sense, the raw material that's behind the production of other raw materials. To give a crude example, until the 1914-18 war, if you wanted either fertilizers or explosives, you had to get hold of Chilean, guana. Guana is accumulated bird shit, accumulated over millions of years in the northern deserts of Chile. During the First World War, based on a blockade, German imperialism developed an alternative, a way of making the basic ingredients for ammunition or fertilizers. But to make it, you use vast amounts of energy. Where does the energy come from? It can come from coal. In the modern world, it's most likely to come from oil. So in the modern world, there's a substitute for lots of things which they used to use wood or metal for 50 or 60 or 100 years ago. Most of these substitutes based on plastics, which at the end of the day come from oil. Oil becomes the thing which becomes the substitute for the other raw materials. Oil, of course, is concentrated in some parts of the world. When you talk about oil, controlling oil is the one area in which it makes sense, in a certain sense, to have old-fashioned capitalist competition. Perhaps I've missed a slight stage out of the story, which I should repeat. When we talk about decolonisation in the 1950s, it was a product of national liberation movements. It was also a product of realisation by the advanced capitalists that really it didn't really matter all that much to them economically if they gave direct control over third world countries, because firstly, these countries were not much interested in their rivals, other capitalist countries, and secondly, the more intelligent had a long-term calculation. Give it a few years, these countries don't have the resources to develop as capitalists in opposition to ourselves. In the end, they come crawling back to us, which of course has happened. Most of the third world countries where you had independent governments attempting independent national development plans 25 or 30 years ago, now increasingly turn to integration of the world market, and their capitalists are the people who are now investing, probably in the New York Stock Exchange, the Egyptian capitalists, the Argentine capitalists, the Indonesian capitalists, the Indian capitalists, and so on and so forth. The great exception is oil, because oil is a product of the raw material of raw materials. It's become increasingly important because oil is the means by which, if you control oil, you actually have some say over the power of what other capitalist countries can do. And here I think when we look at the recent wars, when Tony Blair, I need to say Tony Benn, I'm sorry, I couldn't apologise to him more. When Tony Blair says the war had nothing to do with oil, I mean, to be honest, every work on geostrategy in the Middle East written in the last 50 years has started and ended with the word oil. You can't talk about the politics of the Middle East without talking about the worth of oil. But when we talk about the question of oil, we have to be careful of not putting it in two crude ways. First, it's not just the profits of the American oil companies. Because, to be honest, I don't think Microsoft or Boeing or Monsanto, their directors think, oh, we must shell out in terms of paying for a war so that directors of Exxon can have higher profits and higher dividends than us. It's not that crude. I mean, it's the truth. There's always elements of corruption in capitalism, and if you have a government stocked with oil men, they will try and put the case to the other capitalists who are going to war for oil. But it's not the central thing. The central thing is oil is that one commodity which if one set of capitalists gets hold of, they can deny it to other sets of capitalists. And you cannot understand American policy in the Middle East without understanding that it's not just a question of exploitation of the Middle East. It's a question of, really, where are the centres of accumulated surplus value in the modern world than in advanced industrial countries? We want to get control of the raw material of more raw materials in order to have leverage when it comes to getting access to these other centres of surplus value. I put it like this, the Middle East is the pipeline, the hose pipe, for which they fertilise the garden of world capitalism. If you get control of the hose pipe, you have some control over the garden. But you don't confuse the hose pipe and the garden at any point in time. It's a metaphor probably only makes sense to people who have gardens, but and what we're actually talking about, we're actually saying what what we've seen in terms of if you look at the whole history American imperialism in the Middle East, it's been concerned above all with getting control of oil supplies. And it's interesting, it's not oil supplies in the first place, the United States. Until about 1970, the United States was self-sufficient in oil. I mean, the United States is one of the world's biggest oil producers. Even today, the United States imports half its oil, but of the imports it makes, 2/3 come from the Western Hemisphere. That is from Canada, Mexico, and Venezuela. Or to put it another way, the United States imports as much oil from Venezuela as it does from the whole of the Middle East. If the aim of the war had been simply to get hold of oil from the Middle East in order to go to the United States, there's lots of people make calculations. There's one American economist who's sort of American economist and a Venezuelan nationalist who says, look, we have all this oil in Venezuela. It's more expensive to produce than oil in the United States. He claims, I don't know if it's true, that tar oils in the Orinoco are the world's biggest reserves of oil anywhere. He's making the case, he may be exaggerating, but his argument is, if we didn't spend all this money on military bases, military preparations, wars and so forth in the Middle East, it'd be cheaper for us to get our oil from Venezuela, Mexico and Canada and cut off relations with these horrible governments in the Middle East and so on and so forth. What you can understand it when you understand that I think Japan is between 80 and 90% of Japan's oil comes from the Middle East. Something like 60% of the European Union's oil comes from the Middle East. Japanese foreign policy is long one powerful element in it is security of oil supplies. That is, the United States controlling Middle East oil is a key element in exercising leverage over other capitalists. Now, the last thing I want to say, before I finish and move into some discussion, even this, I think, when we come back to the overall picture, however, the reality is the problem with the United States is just controlling oil doesn't automatically give it access to these resources. Controlling the oil itself is not going to provide that massive boost to the profits of American companies which controlling vast chunks of the third world would do for British capitalism 100 years ago. And therefore, the American capitalism is in a strange situation. It's embarked upon what is effectively a colonial adventure, seizing control of Iraq in order to control the resources of this one valuable part of the third world in order to deny those resources or to ration those resources to other capitalist countries. At the same time, it's by no means guaranteed that the thing can be profitable to it in any sense. It can't be directly profitable. If you work out the profits the United States oil companies will make from controlling the Iraqi oil, they will not even compensate for the costs of the occupation and reconstruction of Iraq. And then when it comes to the real negotiations over getting surplus values from the advanced industrial countries, when it comes to the question of the trade negotiations in Cancun in 2 months' time, I think the French and the Germans will turn to the Americans and say, okay, you control Middle East oil. What are you going to do with your control? We're going to continue to fight for our interests against yours, for our share of the surplus value from the advanced industrial countries against your share. And therefore, when we talk in terms of the Middle East, what we have is, what I'd say is a characteristic feature of modern capitalism, that the battles of the advanced industrial countries are played out in third world countries. In some ways, the civil wars in Africa are mini struggles between, if you want to see it, between French, or they started off as mini struggles between French and American corporations, them each getting their hirelings on the ground, working with them to murder each other and so forth. In the end, it kills 4 million people, devastates much of Africa, causes famines, hunger, people lose their limbs, God knows what. That's what the reality of it is. I mean, the strange thing from the point of world capitalism, this is taking place in what's one of the least significant areas for them. That's why it takes place in a certain sense. They can afford it to take place in Africa, where it's taking place in continental Europe, destroying vast chunks of capital, vast amounts of machinery and so forth. It'd be much more serious to the capitalist system. Not more serious to humanity. I mean, what's taking place in Africa is terribly serious for humanity. The impoverishment of the third world. It's one of the signs of how barbaric capitalism is. What it gets from the third world is not even the lettering on the icing on the cake of world surplus value. But what it gets from the third world, they will not give up under any circumstances, and it shows how desperate and barbaric they are. And the war in the Middle East, they don't mind, really, American capital, in its struggle to maintain hegemony not just over other smaller capitalist countries in Latin America or Southeast or Asia or so forth, but over the other mighty capitalist powers, it doesn't mind how many people it killed in Iraq, how many destruction, how much devastation it kills. That's part of the process it plays. I think the conclusion we have to draw, and I'll go back to the beginning, faced with this horrific system, the idea that it's just a question of a few trade rules, of altering this thing or that thing, a small reform to the international world system, reforms to the World Trade Organization or the IMF, this I think is nonsense. I mean, there are basic things you could demand. Above all, demand cancellation of the debt, which I don't think you'll get that from capitalism short of a revolutionary struggle. But most of the other things people talk about, they're not beginning to tinker with the problem. We live in a world driven to wars which take place mainly in third world countries or peripheral countries, causing devastation. At the same time, the wealth which might once have provided a future for those countries is pumped out of it systematically by the very mechanisms of the system itself.
Right, I'm going to call out the speakers two at a time so people can make their way to the front. The first speaker in the discussion will be Kwang Yul Jang, and he'll be followed by Mike Davies. And while he's just coming down the front, I'll just read out a question that we've had from Rosa, who's from the World Development Movement. The question's addressed to Chris, but anyone could maybe think about what their thoughts are on it. What are the speakers' thoughts on the GATS agreement, free trade zones, the IMF and the WTO? So that's quite a few things to be thinking about.
Hello, comrades. I'm from South Korea. I would like to talk about the very beautiful development of the movement against American imperialism in South Korea. Last year, in June, 2 girls were killed by American tanks, and then American court let them, the drivers of tanks and the people who are responsible, give the freedom. They were not charged, they were free. And then there became very big demonstration in South Korea last December. Every week, in the center of Seoul, there were, in the beginning, 20,000, 50,000, and then 100,000. And 150,000 people demonstrated. And as you know, the president of South Korea now, the Roh Moo-hyun, he is chosen by Korean people who are against American imperialism. They are sick of American imperialism. South Korea is second biggest military base of United States. There are still 37,000 American troops. And this year, and I want to say, the movement is very new. There were a lot of schoolgirls who joined the demonstration because the killed girls were 15 years. And the girls in 15 years, they come to the street and they say to the United States, hey, US soldiers, you listen to us. You accept our law. Otherwise you leave our country. We don't need you to kill us. You said you will protect us against the communists. Then you do your job. Otherwise you have to go out. Get out. And now, this year, the movement developed to the demonstration against Iraq, war in Iraq. It was first anti-war demonstration in South Korea. This time, also young people joined the demonstration, and majority of people were against the South Korean government decision to send troops to Iraq because we don't want this racist war. We are not going to kill Iraqi people. That was the demands of South Korean people. And now, as you know, there is growing tension about North Korea. United States decide to put more $11 billion to modernize the U.S. troops in South Korea. And Japan passed three laws which can make Japan can also attack North Korea. So now there is a lot of militarization in the area, and America sell billions of weapons to South Korea. So now they are making a Cold War against North Korea, and if they believe they are strong enough to beat North Korea without much problem, they will attack North Korea. We have to stop that with South Korean workers, solidarity with Korean people and South Korean workers. Let's fight against American imperialism. Thank you.
Hang on a second. Yeah. After Mike, the next speaker will be Viren Swami. I should just explain, just so that we can get in as many people have asked to speak, we do need people to keep their contributions to 3 minutes, and that's a maximum, you're not obliged to speak for that long. And I'll tap on the mic after 2 minutes just to give people a bit of an idea they need to be winding up. Before Mike speaks, I just want to read out another question from Graham Withers, who's from People and Planet. And he says, when the revolution comes, the policies of the nation will be the choice of the people. Isn't it essential for groups like Oxfam to remind the people what needs to be done in terms of trade and development?
Well, I can't promise to answer that, but I did slightly want to defend Kevin Watkins of Oxfam against this charge that he says free trade will cure everything. The point is, at the moment, we don't even have free trade. We have a position where consumers in rich countries are forced by the Common Agricultural Policy and by the American equivalent to subsidize rich farmers, which actually they don't just cost us more, they actually impoverish farmers in the third world. The insane sugar regime of the European Union, whereby we pay farmers, particularly in France and Germany, but also in Britain, in Lincolnshire, to grow sugar, is madness. I think it's 3 times the world price, and we could actually be importing it from people in the third world so that they can get richer and buy more stuff from us. That actually would be progressive. And there's no argument whatsoever for doing it, except that it helps Jacques Chirac and his equivalent in Germany get re-elected. It's just madness. The whole question, coffee is something else again. Are you seriously suggesting that people should produce coffee at lower than the world price in order that consumers should be able to consume coffee? You wouldn't say that about car workers should be forced to have their wages cut to produce cars so that businesses can buy cars for their employees as a fringe benefit. That's bullshit. The WTO it's a huge problem, and there is going to be a huge battle of it, but it's basically, it was supposed to be something where the third world had more power than they have in the IMF and the World Bank, because it's actually more democratic. But of course, because the real power is organised by the rich countries, they get squeezed out again. That's all I'll say.
Thanks. After Viren, the next speaker will be Mark Blackmore. I've just got another question to read out. How does Chris fit in the growth of offshore service industries, for example, call centres in India, in the context of imperialism?
I think there's really no question that the vast majority of the people of the third world still suffer the effects of imperialism. I think in Southeast Asia, which is the part of the world that I come from, the vast majority of the people haven't really felt any change, really. I mean, if you look at the people of Indonesia, the vast majority of the people of Indonesia and the Philippines still live on less than $2 a day. But I think that the other side of the coin to that, really, is that the revolts against these sufferings, whether it's the Indonesian Revolution in '98 or whether it's the reform movement in many other countries or the realignment of the left in some others, have been really important in breeding a new wave of anti-capitalism that we've seen really in the world since Seattle. I I think it's also important to understand, really, that the struggles in the third world often can take different forms, and one of those forms is nationalism. And I think whether it's the Pan-Africanism that we see in some places in Africa, or the chauvinistic nationalism of some other countries, I think the national question really hasn't disappeared. I think, as Chris argued, just as imperialism has taken different forms in the last century, so nationalism has taken different forms as well. One example of that really is that the indigenous ruling classes that took over much of the colonial countries after decolonialisation have sought to suppress the nationalist movements in their own countries. For example, the Indonesian government for a very long time sought to suppress the East Timorese nationalist movement. And it's the same in the Philippines today, where you have a huge movement against for national freedom, but it's being suppressed by the Filipino government. I think at the same time, these very governments have been struggling against the economic and political power of the major powers. So I think, as Gramsci argued way back in the 20th century, we need to assess these anti-imperialist struggles from the standpoint of the whole alignment of forces in the imperialist system. I think there is one consistent position from which this assessment can be carried out. It's among the workers and the peasants of the third world that we find one enduring force has always been opposed to imperialism. To be fair, these struggles haven't always ended in success, but they've always been. They've always time and time again, they've always been the force that have struggled against imperialism and the capitalist system as a whole. I think Marx made the essential point. And no matter how far the capitalist relations spread, the fundamental task of human liberation in the third world falls to the working people. Writing about British rule in India, for example, Marx argued that the population in India could only achieve freedom, could only taste the fruits of freedom, if the British population in Britain overthrew their government.
True, the US is engaged in a colonial occupation of Iraq. This is for very specific, both economic and strategic reasons. By conquering Iraq and having military bases in Iraq, the US is in a position to dominate the Middle East, which is the area which has 2/3 of the world's oil reserves, and therefore it is in a position, as Chris argued, to put the squeeze on all its major rivals, including not just Europe and Japan, but also China, which is increasingly dependent upon imports of Middle East oil. It may be that the problems of the occupation of Iraq forced the US to occupy other countries, but that's a reflection of the contradictions and difficulties of its policies, not that the solution for global capitalism lies in reconquering the bulk of the third world. What Chris is describing is a paradox, but paradoxes are true sometimes, and this paradox is true, that the reason why there's so much poverty and suffering in the third world is not because the major centers of capitalism rely on the bulk of the third world for their profits, but rather that they don't see the bulk of the third world as being worth exploiting. And that then brings me to Harry's point about reform or revolution. Because the system is in crisis, they're not prepared to hand over the quite limited resources that could begin to alleviate the acute poverty that exists in the third world. 2.8 billion people in the third world live on an income of less than $2 a day. It would take 1% of global national income to lift those people above that poverty line, which, in terms of the wealth of global capitalism, isn't very much. They're not prepared to surrender that 1%. They can't afford to spare it because the crisis of profitability that global capitalism faces is so serious. They are prepared to spare it for other purposes. That global 1% of world national income isn't much more than the Pentagon's military budget. They'll spend it, in other words, on using the violence that they need to prop up their system. So if we do want to alleviate the terrible suffering of the third world, we need a revolution, not as a matter of dogma, because that's the only way to break this system with such obscene and perverted priorities that leave so many, literally billions of people suffering terribly.
Just hang on a sec. After Richard, the next speaker will be Joe Cardwell. I've just got another question to read out. It says, free trade under any capitalist system is an oxymoron. Should we forget nation states and directly attack transnational companies? And that's a question for the floor.
Right, yeah, I'd sort of like to echo our friend here in a way. Yeah, I'd like to know how is it possible and how can we work with the trade justice movement? Because I think it's possible that we could be missing a great opportunity there. Yeah, that's all I want to say. Thank you.
After Joe, the next speaker will be Antoine Boulange. And I've got another question. Shouldn't we, as socialists, reject terms like Third World as part of the language of imperialism and oppression?
Okay, yeah. I want to try and answer the question around the state and the transnational companies and stuff, and at the same time sort of look at the changes in imperialism, because I think they're pretty key in terms of understanding the way in which the Third World is being treated at this moment in time, and also the way in which we fight back against it. I think what sort of is really key in terms of the change that you saw prior to the Second World War, where, you know, when Chris talks about the fact that in the British Empire, 75% of export, you know, the capital went into the parts of the empire, the colonialised countries and so on. That was the way in which Britain managed to extract from those countries the, you know, their profits, that managed to exploit them and so on. It created almost a mirror image of its own state over in the other colonial countries, if you like. The change, I think, through after the Second World War that started to happen, the change in imperialism that you started to see, was that the difference, I think, was the way in which you saw the militarisation of the Western capitalist states in order to protect their right to make profit. The competition between the Western capitals became the key thing in order to protect the profit and the accumulation that the system totally bases itself on. I think the way, therefore, in which I don't know if I'm making myself particularly clear here, the way in which I think therefore, the exploitation of the Third World has been maintained from one system to another has been the way in which the market has operated, the way in which the nation state has operated, the way in which you've started to see the massive multinational corporations, the centralisation of capital. Those things I don't think could have happened or have been helped unless you'd seen the role of the nation state in militarising the states in order to protect the role of that capital abroad, the way in which you've seen the transformation of the finance systems from being just national systems to international finance systems as a way of coordinating the removal of profit in terms of bringing it from one capitalist company to another and so on. I think, therefore, it's massively tied up. The fight against imperialism is not just a fight against the multinationals, but it's a fight against the state that aids those multinationals in exploiting, you know, workers and exploiting the Third World and so on. At full stop. So I think we have to combine the fight of the two together. I think further to that, I think we should absolutely call for, and we should work with trade justice movements in terms of absolutely calling for the end to the exploitation of what's happening in the Third World. But unless we understand really where the key motor of the system is and the key way in which those people make profit and maintain their ability to accumulate capital, then we can't really attack the heart of the system that's keeping the Third World in the situation that it's in at the moment. Unless we attack the heart of imperialism, which is undoubtedly the Western capitalists, and unless we attack, I think, if we don't attack those people at the top, I don't think we have any real chance of alleviating the crap that people in the West, the Western workers go through, at the same time as the crap that people in the Third World go through. We've got really to build an international movement to challenge the basis of the nation state, but to challenge the basis of the multinationals as well, because that's on the basis on which the exploitation takes place. That's the basis on which capital organises. In other words, what I'm saying is that Western workers have an absolute strong and fundamental link to workers in the Third World and to Third World countries in terms of fighting back against their own governments and fighting against imperialism. I think the only way in which we can understand fighting for the right of fighting in terms of trade justice and so on is in the context of internationalising the struggle against imperialism full stop. It's a stepping stone on the way to smashing the core part of what capitalism bases itself on.
Okay. Antoine will be followed by Manitano, who will be the final speaker, and apologies to people who put in slips, but we are just running out of time.
Last year, France sent 3 times troops in Africa, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Centrafrique, and last month in Congo-Kinshasa. It was called Zaire before. And I think it's important, it's not a relation only between France and Africa, because if we see the reality of Africa today, it's 10% of world population, but less than 1% of world trade. And when France send troops in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, it's not to dominate coffee, production of coffee in Côte d'Ivoire. I think it's linked with the competition between big powers, because if France doesn't send troops in Côte d'Ivoire, another big power will do the same, and still, this country, we see now there is discussion in USA, do they send troops in Liberia or not? And I think it's a competition between big powers, which is the main reason. But the result, it's barbarism. Since 1996, there were 3 million dead people in Congo-Kinshasa. It was the biggest, more barbarous war since the Second World War in the world. I think the consequence is a catastrophe. And to finish, the left in France, Chris talked about Bernard Cassen. When France sent troops in Côte d'Ivoire, he supported it because it was a democratic and humanitarian intervention. And it's a drama because in France there is no peace camp with Chirac. When we see Africa, it's evident. But the problem of this, it was forget the main problem. The main problem, the source of the violence is here. And I think the words of Karl Liebknecht, the main enemy is here, are still right. And we have to do this, to fight here against US imperialism, but against French or British imperialism.
Keep it short, because we're running out of time. Thank you.
Very difficult. Okay. The argument that has been made that imperialism is in the first instance about competition between the major capitalist powers, I think is an important one. So also is the link that Chris makes with the fact that as a result of this competition, vast sections of the world are driven into poverty. So that the thing that the attack guy said, what this fellow just, Bernard Cassen, or whatever his name is, I think not only is it a mistake, but it's positively dangerous. I believe the previous speaker, by his example in Côte d'Ivoire, demonstrated that anyway. But there's other senses in which it is dangerous because it cannot take account of how the ruling classes in the third world themselves begin to reorient, to accommodate to the... well, thanks for your enthusiasm. To accommodate to the restructuring of global capitalism that takes place under the aegis of the likes of American imperialism and so on. So that if you just cast your mind back very quickly to those countries which were on the UN Security Council and what they did when the issue of whether or not there will be a vote took place. Cameroon, Paul Biya, one of the most corrupt governments ever in the history of Africa, more likely than not, ever in the history of the world, getting new military support, getting new contracts, such that he'll be able to exploit his people better and repress them better. In Guinea, the same thing was happening. In Guinea, in addition to the new alliance with the United States, was also the fact that a direct outcome was also the fact that military capitalism, as Chris described, is the policy that Guinea is pursuing in Liberia and in that part of West Africa. So when we add these things together, I think that becomes important, absolutely important, to insist that as long as we understand quite clearly that imperialism is not only, or even centrally, about the North and the South, or whatever you call it, West and Third World, then we also have to understand that the fight against imperialism in the Third World is also a class fight. That it's important, unlike Bernard Cassen, to be able to say that fighting imperialism is the surest way also of fighting poverty in the Third World as well. And that is why I see no problem about working side by side with the trade justice movement. After all, when we talk about the global anti-capitalist movement, Seattle is our original reference point. That was also a site where trade justice movement people were there. But I tell you something, the point about reform or revolution, be it in the first world or the third world or with any other world, well, the human world, is essentially that reformists, revolutionaries are always the best fighters for reform. Simply because they do not see only this or that aspect of the system, but they see that the thisness or the thatness is actually linked to one. We fight on all fronts precisely because of that understanding. So that if it comes to a question of fighting imperialism in the same way as the left in Europe managed to transform the anti-capitalist movement by reorienting it around the world, we learn the same things, we apply the same things. In Ghana, we've tried to do that. In many places in Africa, we've tried to do that. So when it comes to the question of Cancun, for example, or the GATT, as somebody asked, I say simply this, that yes, we will add our voices to those who say that you should shut down the World Bank and the IMF and the WTO. But whether or not the GATT is passed, when it comes and they start privatizing, we'll fight them as well. We'll win on that basis. On that basis, we build the global solidarity that we need to bury capitalism once and for all.
Okay, well, thank you to everyone who took part in the discussion and the questions, and I'm sorry about the people who didn't get to speak. But this is a meeting on the part of the course on imperialism and anti-imperialism, a guide. The next meeting in this course, you'll see in your timetables, is Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock, and it's on Was the Soviet Union a Counterweight to the US? And that's in the Clark Hall, 7 o'clock on Tuesday. But people might also be interested, they're interested in some of these processes, in the next meeting tonight on how capitalism underdeveloped Africa, which is taking place in the Clark Hall at 7 o'clock. That's all in your timetables. There's just a couple of other announcements before Chris comes to sum up. The first one is that the film Bowling for Columbine will now start at 8:40 in the Palms room, not at the advertised time of 9 o'clock. So people need to get there for 8:40 if they want to see that film. The other thing is just to encourage people to go to the Bookmarks bookstore, which is the Socialist Bookshop, which is open between 9:30 a.m. and 9:30 p.m. just off the Institute of Education bar, selling books, tapes of the meetings, and apparently even socialist mugs and mouse mats. So, which are interesting concepts, what a socialist mug would be like. So I'll just call Chris in to sum up.
You see, firstly, just a couple of one question. Someone asked, if Japan is so dependent on oil, why doesn't it develop alternative energy sources? Japan has developed alternative energy sources. It has one of the biggest nuclear programs in the world. For a similar reason, France developed a nuclear program. The aim of the nuclear program is to protect the Japanese, you want to call it Japanese state capitalism, Japanese imperialism, against suddenly being deprived of certain resources in a situation of acute crisis worldwide, which the Americans decided to actually, they were going to take the oil and not let it go to Japan. I mean, I don't think the Japanese ruling class think as far off war with the United States. They do think in terms of these people are at each other's throats. And we know they're at each other's throats because during the great upsurge in oil prices, 1973-74, we know that the American government, dominated essentially by Kissinger, was quite prepared to see the oil price rise because they thought it'd do more damage to the Japanese economy than would the United States economy. So these people do conspire. I'm not conspiracy theorists, but they do conspire on occasions. And whenever Tony Blair says, this is a conspiracy theory, then you know they are conspiring. I think it's a more fundamental argument. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them. There are other meetings, of course. I should add, there's a whole discussion on what's responsible for the underdevelopment of third world countries and so forth, which people should go into. And Charlie Kimber is speaking in the Palms Bar on Wednesday on this. And there's a whole series of discussion which I think people should go into because, as Alex said, the more the world, the international movement against capitalism develops, the more these issues come up and the more we have to argue them through. And here I just want to say something about the free trade argument. You see, of course, the European Union is out to exploit us and to make things harder for third world countries by paying rich farmers too much to produce goods and then dumping them on third world countries. But the problem with the Oxfam approach and the Clare Short approach, I mean, the two both argue the same thing together, is it's really this idea, if we could just tinker with this, and the campaign to tinker with this one aspect of the system, then actually everything will be all right. The central thing to understand is there's what's used to be called in the 19th century, when Britain ruled the world, free trade imperialism. The people who control the capital, if they impose the rules on the world, then they don't necessarily have to intervene. They don't necessarily have to send troops to a country. for the resources to flow from that country to their capitalists. That's what we're talking about, and that's the basic structure of the system. And here you have to say, once you start off meddling, just say things in terms of meddling, sometimes you meddle to benefit. Sometimes, as a coffee question, I don't want coffee farmers to starve to death because too much coffee is produced. But then I think, is too much coffee being produced? Is it right? Is it the case that I should be able to drink in the morning, because I'm a bit of an addict, 2 or 3 big cups of coffee, and some peasant who, on a sugar plantation in northern Argentina has to sit there thinking, no, next week I'll have coffee, this week I won't. And then you have to say no, because if you're talking about burning the coffee, you're actually saying there must be some better way of organising the system so that the coffee farmer can get a decent price and the peasant in northern Argentina can drink his cup of coffee. There must be some way of running the system. Otherwise, you're back into the old capitalist method. Let's throw food, let's throw food into the sea in order to keep the price of wheat up, even when people are starving. And that is not the alternative. Free trade will produce that situation. Free trade produces surpluses some years, deficits other years in terms of food. You have to talk in terms of ways of intervening in that, regulating. You have to talk about, at the end of the day, you have to talk about planning on a world scale to deal with it. But you have to then talk about anti-capitalist measures which lead in that direction. Now, when we talk about reforms, some reforms do lead people to fight the system, and some reforms lead to diversion. You see, and I'd put the difference is, there's a difference between fighting for reforms and reformism. Reform is a set of beliefs which believe you can change the present system, leaving the essential power structure intact. This is what people say. I mean, there's people my belief is people believe if only the Tobin tax was introduced, we'd overcome third world poverty. If you believe that, you're suffering from a delusion about how the system operates. If you say, let's squeeze the rich to the Tobin tax and that's a good thing, okay, I'm in favour of that. If you believe the Tobin tax is going to solve the problems of the world, you're not actually understanding how deeply ingrained the impoverishment, the millions of children who die each day, the 18,000 children who die each day, how deeply ingrained that is in the way the system operates. And you have to then talk similarly, we have whole governments committed to this. I don't believe that because reforms are difficult to achieve, reformism as an ideology disappears. The Lula government in Latin America is a reformist ideology. It believes that somehow you can sign a deal with the International Monetary Fund, you can give independence to the Bank of Brazil under a bank who used to work for one of the top American banks. You can sign a deal by which the former Conservative president becomes head of the Senate and somehow get reforms for the rest of the people. I don't believe you can do that. What I do believe is I think you can fight for reforms, and in fighting reforms begin to discover you have to fight on the system as a whole. And there are reforms I'm in favour of. I'm absolutely for fighting to the death against GATS. GATS is allowing rich corporations in the West to send the bailiffs into the poorest people in the world, if you want to use the analogy. And I'm for fighting against that. I'm for fighting on the question of intellectual property rights. What are the intellectual property rights about? What it's about is the rich corporations think that what they call intellectual piracy costs them $200 billion a year. By intellectual piracy, they mean people in India getting penicillin drugs at a quarter of the price we pay here. My view is, why shouldn't they get paid? They get paid a lot less than a quarter we get paid. Why shouldn't they get the drugs at a quarter of the price? Campaigning over these issues, campaigning for the cancellation of third world debt, campaigning against against this disgusting behaviour by which Western corporations promise in return for promises for raw materials in Africa, then make alliances with local capitalists who then buy arms from the West, and then the local people have to pay back for the armaments. I'm for campaigning against it. All these are reforms. But when you talk about these reforms, then you'll begin to challenge the power of the system, and you begin to develop a movement which takes the system on. And in terms of the anti-capitalist movement, there are arguments. I think, to be honest, the question of third world debt is much, much more important in impoverishment of the world than the question of fair trade. Now, that doesn't mean I go to people and say, get involved in fair trade campaigns, say, you're wasting your time and so on and so forth. I say, let's fight against the question of debt. Even with fair trade just means the capitalists in third world countries have slightly more money. They will still be squeezing the mass of the population for the debt repayments. Let's cancel the debt repayments. These sorts of demands have to go forward. They're not revolutionary demands in themselves, but they begin to raise the question of challenging the system as a whole. But above all in this movement, we have to say it's the basic structure of the system as a whole. The system as a whole is a structure which means it will not budge. It will not budge on that system, and it's no good tinkering around the edges. Now that doesn't mean, that means it also has relevance in third world countries. In third world countries, if that's what the system is, then in order to gain anything, The mass of people have to be very realistic. They have to understand their own ruling classes are part of the world system. It's not like colonial period, in which the advanced Western colonists used to treat, the third world capitalists like wogs, spit on them, not allow them into their parks, and so on and so forth. It's a system in which third world capital is a partner of first world capital. They have common interests, and so on and so forth. They put their money in the same banks. They operate in the same way in the New York and London stock exchanges, and so on and so forth. In that system, if you're in a third world country, you have to be much more radical than in the past, not less radical. You have to be more radical in your demands, more radical in your struggles, and you have to raise this question. It's not a question of reform. If you wanted to change Brazil, you have to fight for state power in Brazil, and not just fight state power in Brazil, state power in Brazil as part of a revolutionary movement right across Latin America and drawing in vast numbers of people in order to challenge the system as a whole. Now, those things are realistic. And, those things are times in history when things seem unreal. The present moment, for instance, in Latin America, where you have rising struggles in several countries simultaneously, these things are not outside the realm of possibility. We don't achieve them. We know in Africa, if you don't fight like this, the alternative is the horror of the civil wars, the famine, the militarised capitalism, the IMF, the whole lot. You have to fight in this radical sense if you get anything out of the system at the moment. And that's a message I think we have to carry through the movements around globalisation. We carry it in debt campaigns, fair trade campaigns, and so forth. We're with everyone who wants to fight against the horrors this system inflicts, how little the demands they put. But really, you can't even get the little things unless you fight for the big things.
Can I ask, can everybody leave by that door? Because if you leave that door, you're going to get into a fight with everybody leaving the Ben meeting. So can you all leave that way, please? Thanks.